All right, ready to dive deep into the Boston Tea Party with me? This time, we're going beyond the surface, exploring why a cup of tea, of all things, sparked a revolution. We're using the Boston Tea Party, one of history's greatest protests by geographics on YouTube, as our guide today.
What often gets lost in the story is just how brilliant the colonists' strategy was. Destroying property, yeah, but specifically TE, that was a powerful statement. It kind of hit on those Enlightenment ideals too, showing how unhappy the colonists were without resorting to widespread violence.
Yeah, it's really interesting they chose tea. I mean, there were other things being taxed, right? What made tea so special?
Oh, absolutely. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was like this symbol of British identity, of their economic power. Targeting tea was a direct challenge to British control. Plus, think about the East India Company. Their monopoly on tea basically forced colonists to buy from them. That really fueled resentment, making tea the perfect target for resistance.
And taxation without representation. That really gets at the heart of the colonists' anger, doesn't it? Can you explain what that meant for them back then?
Well, imagine this. Colonists were being taxed by a parliament where they had no elected representatives, no voice in the decisions, but they still had to pay. Talk about unfair, right?
Yep.
That's what fueled their desire for, self-determination.
So it wasn't just the money, it was about having a say in their own government.
Exactly. And to really see how things boiled over, we got to go back a bit further. The 1760s saw all these acts from the British that just kept ratcheting up the tension.
Let's rewind to 1765 then, the Stamp Act. Weren't the Sons of Liberty really active in resisting that?
Oh yeah, they were front and center. The Sons of Liberty and tons of other colonists saw the Stamp Act as this blatant power grab, a way to just take their money. So they protested, boycotted British goods, even used, let's say, persuasion to stop it from being enforced. And they actually got it repealed. That showed them what they could do together, emboldened them for what was coming next.
I've always wondered, how did they manage to get the Stamp Act repealed? What made their resistance so effective?
It was a multi-pronged approach. They used the press really well to get people on their side, organized boycotts that hurt British merchants, and formed these committees of correspondence to coordinate resistance across the colonies. It was like a united front. The British couldn't enforce it.
Wow, so economic pressure, public awareness, coordinated action, that's a potent mix. But the British didn't give up that easily, did they? The Townshend Acts came along just a couple years later.
Yeah, the Townshend Acts, those were sneaky. Trying to assert control with these indirect taxes on things like tea, glass, paper. But the colonists weren't fooled. They saw right through it, another attempt at taxation without representation.
So instead of backing down, the British doubled down, and the colonists were already mobilizing.
Exactly. Boycotts got bigger, protests more frequent, tensions just kept rising. And then, in 1770, well, we have the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, that must have been a turning point for public opinion. Was there any chance of reconciliation after that, or is the relationship just too damaged?
It definitely made things worse, that's for sure. There were attempts at reconciliation, sure, but those fundamental issues, the taxes, the lack of representation, those were still there, simmering. And the massacre just reminded everyone how easily things could turn violent, further fuel the colonists' desire to break free.
So 1773, things are already a powder keg. Then comes the Tea Act, meant to help the East India Company, but really it was the last straw, wasn't it?
Yeah, you could say that. The Tea Act, on the surface, it was supposed to help this struggling company, right? But the colonists saw it for what it was, a blatant attempt to control the colonial tea trade. Like the British wanted to tighten their grip, it went against everything the colonists believed in.
And that's when Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty step up, ready to take action. They saw the symbolic power of tea. This was their moment.
The Sons of Liberty, with all their experience organizing resistance, they were the perfect group to lead this fight against the Tea Act. They knew they needed something big, something symbolic to rally support, to show they meant business.
Okay, so we've got the context. Simmering resentment, a history of resistance, the Tea Act as the trigger. But why tea? Why not target something else that was being taxed?
Tea was just perfect, symbolically. It was everywhere. It represented British control in their everyday lives. Destroying the tea wasn't just rejecting a tax, it was rejecting British authority, period.
It's also interesting that they didn't, attack the people involved in the tea trade. They went after the tea itself. It was about the system, not individual.
Right, and by destroying property without hurting anyone, they made a powerful statement about their principles. They were taking a stand, but they weren't being violent. This also helped them gain support from more people, It made their cause seem even more just.
So the stage is set, tensions are sky high, the Sons of Liberty are ready to act. What happens next? How do they actually pull off the Boston Tea Party?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
So he left off with the Sons of Liberty, all set to make a move that would change history. What actually went down that night in Boston Harbor?
Okay, so it's December 16th, 1773, and this group of colonists, some of them dressed as Native Americans, they board 3 ships docked in the harbor. And then super systematically, they dumped 342 chests of tea right into the water. It was this act of defiance, so calculated that really shook things up, even across the Atlantic.
I've always been fascinated by the whole image of the Boston Tea Party, the chests of tea going overboard, the colonists in disguise. Why dress up as Native Americans, though? What was the point of that?
Well, that disguise did a few things. For one, it gave the guys some anonymity, right? Helped protect them from any consequences. But it was also symbolic. It kind of tapped into this idea of indigenous resistance against colonial rule. And visually, it just made a powerful statement, something people wouldn't forget, both in the colonies and back in Britain.
It's pretty amazing they pulled it off without getting caught. It must have taken a ton of planning, right?
Oh yeah, the Boston Tea Party was planned down to the last detail. The Sons of Liberty, they had this whole network of informants, supporters, people helping with the logistics. They picked a time when security was weak, and they were in and out like clockwork.
Planning is one thing, but actually going through with it with so much on the line, that takes serious guts.
No doubt about it. These guys weren't just complaining. They were risking everything. Their jobs, their reputations, maybe even their lives. It shows how deeply they believed in this cause, how far they were willing to go for liberty.
So, tea's in the harbor, message sent. What did the British do?
Oh, they weren't happy. Their response was fast and harsh. They enacted these laws, called the Intolerable Acts, trying to isolate Massachusetts and crush any further dissent.
We mentioned those earlier, but I think it's worth breaking down exactly what made them so intolerable, right?
These acts, they were meant to punish Massachusetts for the Tea Party and scare other colonies straight, so they wouldn't get any ideas. One of the worst was the Boston Port Act, which basically shut down the entire port until the East India Company got paid back for the tea. This crippled Boston's economy, merchants, artisans, workers, everyone suffered.
Wow, closing the port must have been devastating. Boston relied on trade, right? What else did the British do?
They also passed the Massachusetts Government Act. That revoked the colony's charter, putting it directly under British control. No more self-governance for them.
Sounds like they really wanted to make an example of Massachusetts. Did they even think about how this would affect the other colonies?
It's likely they underestimated how much this would actually unite the colonies. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts just made everyone else feel threatened too.
So their plan backfired. Trying to crush the rebellion just pushed the colonies closer together.
Exactly. The other colonies saw what happened to Massachusetts as a warning. If the British could take away one colony's rights, they could do it to anyone.
And this shared sense of danger led to the First Continental Congress, right?
Yep. The Intolerable Acts really forced the colonies to work together. So in September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. This was a huge step toward a unified response to British policies.
So the seeds of revolution are definitely being planted. What were the big takeaways from this First Continental Congress? What'd they decide?
Well, they issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, laying out all their complaints against British policies. They agreed on a boycott of British goods to put some economic pressure on them. And maybe most importantly, they set up these committees of correspondence to keep in touch and coordinate resistance across all the colonies.
Sounds like they were gearing up for a potential split from Great Britain. Did they actually talk about independence at that point?
Independence wasn't officially declared at the First Continental Congress, no. But the idea was gaining momentum. The delegates knew they had to stick together and agreed to meet again if the British didn't address their concerns.
So the stage is set for a showdown. The British are digging in their heels and the colonies are banding together more and more. What happens next?
Well, the tension keeps building and building, ultimately leading to a turning point, the battles of Lexington and Concord.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive into the Boston Tea Party. All right, so we've gone from simmering tensions and a bold protest to the British clamping down, which kind of predictably just made things worse. Now, those famous shots fired at Lexington and Concord, what happened after that?
Well, those battles, Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775, that was the official start of the American Revolutionary War. It went from a political fight to, an all-out armed rebellion.
It's wild to think, right? A disagreement about TA leading to a full-blown war. What made those battles so important? Did they really change the whole course of things?
Oh, Lexington and Concord were huge, absolutely pivotal. They showed the world that the colonists were ready to fight for their independence. This wasn't just protesting anymore, it was coordinated military action, like a whole different level of conflict.
So the Boston Tea Party wasn't just symbolic, it really set off a chain reaction that ended with armed resistance.
Exactly. The Tea Party, then the Intolerable Acts, the colonies coming together, it all led to those first battles. Lexington and Concord changed the relationship between Britain and the colonies forever, pushed them toward a total break.
And just a little over a year later, July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, a new nation is born. How did the Boston Tea Party shape the ideals of this new America?
The Boston Tea Party had a big impact on what ended up in that declaration. No taxation without representation, self-governance, defending liberty. Those were all central to the Tea Party, and they became like the foundation of American identity.
It's amazing, huh? A protest against tea taxes echoing through generations, shaping a whole country.
The Boston Tea Party goes beyond just the history books, though. It's this timeless story about fighting tyranny, wanting freedom, and that desire for self-determination. It's universal. That's why it still inspires people all over the world who are fighting for their own rights.
So the Boston Tea Party, it wasn't really about tea at all, was it? It was about something much bigger. Standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible.
It's a testament to what people can achieve together. Ordinary people having the guts to challenge injustice. It reminds us that even small acts of defiance can start a movement, inspire generations to fight for a better world.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We've uncovered the whole story of the Boston Tea Party, the motivations behind it, the dramatic consequences that followed. It's a story about the power of ideas, the fight for freedom, and the legacy of those who dared to stand up to the status quo.
And it's a story that still matters today. It reminds us that the fight for freedom and justice never really ends. The Boston Tea Party, it's like a call to action, to speak up against what's wrong, to fight for a fairer, more just world.
As we wrap up our look at the Boston Tea Party, I'm just struck by the courage of those who were involved. Their actions, driven by their desire for liberty, they changed the course of history. It's inspiring, to say the least.
And as you go about your day, think about what the Boston Tea Party means to you. What can we learn from it? How can we be courageous and stand up for what's right, just like those colonists did? How can we each play a part in building a world that truly reflects those ideals they fought so hard for?
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the Boston Tea Party. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.